Hello and welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the peritoneum. I'm first going to talk about the parts of the peritoneum. Then I'm going to talk about the lesser and greater omentum and the mesentery. And then I will talk about the different structures you'll find in the peritoneal cavity. So now that we've covered the anatomy of the structures and the accessory organs in the digestive system, we need something to protect them. And that's what the peritoneum does. It's a serous coat that not only protects but also fixates the organ in place and forms a serous coat around the organs for a smooth and wet environment in the abdominal cavity. Now, my program didn't have a good presentation of the peritoneum, unfortunately, as you see. So let's work with one thing at a time about the peritoneum to understand it fully. So we can start by making a vertical cut of the abdominal cavity and look at it from this perspective. You'll get this view, right? Now, for orientation's sake, the liver is here, and this is the stomach, and here the transverse colon, and then you got this small intestine here and the sigmoid colon of the large intestine. Now, this is a woman's abdominal cavity, so the womb is here. All right, so let's start by adding a perfectly drawn diaphragm right here. So the peritoneum consists of only two parts. The first part is the peritoneum parietale, highlighted in green. The parietal peritoneum lines the walls of the abdomen and the pelvic cavity, and it's kind of a 3D dimensional. If you imagine, it starts anteriorly at the anterior abdominal wall and then wraps around along the lateral abdominal wall and then connects at the posterior abdominal wall. So that's the parietal peritoneum along the abdominal wall and the pelvic cavity. The second part is the peritoneum viscerale, the visceral peritoneum, which lines the walls of organs, forming a wet serous coat, as you see here in blue. And between these two, we have a cavity called the peritoneum cavity, or the cavitas peritonealis in Latin, which contains a serous fluid produced by the peritoneum for a wet environment. Now we can start by looking at the visceral peritoneum. Now, as you can see, the visceral peritoneum covers various organs differently. So there are three ways that the visceral peritoneum covers the organs, as you see here. This is a cross-section of the abdomen, keep that in mind. The first type of internal organs are the intraperitoneal viscera, which are completely invested in the visceral peritoneum, as you see here in blue. Here I've listed all the internal organs that are completely invested by a visceral peritoneum. These include the stomach, the spleen back there, the cecum and the appendix. The transverse colon, the sigmoid colon, the upper part of the rectum are also completely invested in the visceral peritoneum, and also the jejunum and the ileum of the small intestine. So all of them are the intraperitoneal organs because these organs are completely invested by the visceral peritoneum. So next we have the mesoperitoneal viscera, which are the internal organs covered by the visceral peritoneum from three different sides, as you see here. Here I've listed all the internal organs that are partly covered by the visceral peritoneum. These include the liver, you get the gallbladder, the ascending and the descending colon, the middle part of the rectum, and also the urinary bladder is partially covered by the visceral peritoneum when it's full. And then we have the retroperitoneal viscera, which are covered by the peritoneum from only one side. And here I've listed all the retroperitoneal internal organs, which include the duodenum, the pancreas, the kidneys, as you see here, and their suprarenal glands, and also the ureter and the empty urinary bladder are covered by the visceral peritoneum from only one side. So now that we looked at how the visceral peritoneum covers the organs, we need to know the course of the peritoneum. How does the peritoneum go? So the parietal peritoneum, the one that covers the walls of the abdomen and the pelvic cavity, continues into the visceral peritoneum through these four ligaments up here in this area. So the first ligament by which the parietal peritoneum continues into the visceral peritoneum is this one, the ligamentum falciforme, connecting the visceral peritoneum on the liver to the parietal peritoneum on the anterior abdominal wall. So let's check that one. Then we have to remove the diaphragm to see the other ligaments. You'll see the ligamentum coronarium connecting the liver to the parietal peritoneum under the diaphragm. So that's this one. Then superiorly, you will still have the coronal ligament here, right? But on either side of it, you have the ligamentum triangulare dextrum, the right triangular ligament. So let's check that one. And then since we have a right triangular ligament, we need a left triangular ligament as well, connecting the visceral peritoneum on the liver to the parietal peritoneum under the diaphragm as well. So let's stick that one as well. Now from the liver, the ligaments of the visceral peritoneum are going to continue downwards and cover the liver. So that's still the visceral peritoneum, right? Keep that in mind. And in front of it is the parietal peritoneum covering everything alongside the walls of the abdominal cavity, right? Now the visceral peritoneum is going to continue down from the liver and connect to other organs under it. And all the ligaments under the liver, we call them the lesser omentum. So the ligaments of the lesser omentum under the liver are 3, and they all start at porta hepatica of the liver. Remember that one? So the first ligament is the ligamentum hepatogastricum, and this one goes from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. And then we have the ligamentum hepatoduodenale, which goes from the liver to the duodenum. And then we have the ligamentum hepatorenale, and to see this one we need to look behind the liver. This one goes from the liver to the right kidney. So keep that in mind. All these 3 ligaments, we call them the lesser omentum, and the way I like to remember it is that all the ligaments above the lesser curvature of the stomach are the lesser omentum under the liver, of course. And then all the ligaments from the greater curvature of the stomach are the greater omentum. Alright, and so the greater omentum has 3 ligaments, as you see here. But what's interesting here is that these 3 ligaments are a continuation of this ligament right here. So if you imagine the ligamentum hepatogastricum of the lesser omentum attaches to the lesser curvature of the stomach, right? But then it continues on and covers the surface of the stomach, as you see. But remember, it's still the ligamentum hepatogastricum. And then it continues out from the greater curvature of the stomach and form these 3 ligaments you see here on the left, which are called the greater omentum. So the 3 ligaments of the greater omentum are formed by this ligament, the ligamentum hepatogastricum. So the first one is ligamentum gastrophrenicum. And remember, when you see the word phrenicum, then it's related to the diaphragm. So this ligament goes from the stomach to the diaphragm. And then we have the ligamentum gastrosplenicum. This splenicum means the spleen, so it goes from the stomach to the spleen. And then we have the ligamentum gastrocolicum. This one connects to the transverse column of the large intestine, but the way it does that, the way it goes to the large intestine is a little different, because it doesn't go directly to the transverse column from the stomach. This ligament goes in front of the intestines and then curves back and then connects to the transverse column. So if you go back to this picture again, remember this is a vertical section of the abdominal cavity. The liver is up here, and this is the stomach. That means that the lesser omentum is here, and this is the ligamentum hepatogastricum that goes from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach, and then continues and covers the surface of the stomach and forming the greater omentum, which include this ligament, the ligamentum gastrocolicum. And the way this one goes is that it continues down from the greater curvature of the stomach to linea terminalis of the pelvis. And then from here, it curves and goes to the transverse colon. And so as it curves, it forms this thick layer in front of the organs, as you see here. And so at the transverse colon, it splits at the taenia ommentalis. I don't know if you're familiar with this structure, but the muscle layer of the walls of the large intestines forms these elevated folds, and one of them is called the taenia ommentalis. So it curves around and stops at another fold called the taenia mesocolica, which is also formed by the muscle layer of the large intestine. So that is how this ligament attaches to the transverse column. And so all of these 3 ligaments I just mentioned, along with this curvature right here, are the greater omentum. Keep that in mind. And so the ligamentum gastrocolicum stops there, and then it continues as what is called mesocolon transversum, or the mesentery. and then attaches to the posterior abdominal wall. So the mesentery connects the intestines to the posterior abdominal wall, and we have two of them. One is the mesocolon transversum I mentioned earlier, and the other one is the one connecting the small intestines and the sigmoid colon to the posterior abdominal wall, as you see, the radix mesentery. And the radix mesentery starts at the second lumbar vertebrae and then continues and connects to all the intestines. And I want you to keep in mind that the mesentery completely surrounds the intestine. So if you remember this picture, the mesentery is this one, as you see. It surrounds the intestines and connects them to the posterior abdominal wall. And just for orientation's sake, the ascending and descending colons here. So that was the visceral peritoneum. Now, to understand the peritoneum fully, you need to know the different structures you'll find in the peritoneal cavity as well. And remember, that's the cavity between the parietal and the visceral peritoneum. Alright, so the peritoneal cavity has three levels. The first one is the upper level above the mesocolon transversum, so up here. Then the middle layer below the mesocolon transversum, but above the level of the linea terminalis. And then we got the lower level under the linea terminalis in the pelvis minor, as you see here in the picture in orange. Alright, so we'll start with the upper level first. So the upper level has two recesses and one bursa. And recess means a small opening, while a bursa is a small fluid-filled sac containing serous fluid. Alright, so the first recess is the recessus subphrenicum. It's below the diaphragm, as you see here. And then we have the recessus subhepaticus under the liver, as you see here. And then we have the bursa ommentalis highlighted right here. The bursa ommentalis is bordered superiorly by the diaphragm and the caudate lobe, and then inferiorly by the mesocolon and the colon transversi, and then anteriorly by the lesser omentum, the stomach, the gastrocolicum, and also the ligamentum gastrosplenicum. It goes laterally, so you really can't see it in this picture, but it attaches to the spleen from the stomach laterally, and also forms the anterior wall of the bursa ommentalis. Alright, so, and then posteriorly by the partial peritoneum at the posterior abdominal wall. So that's the borders in the bursa ommentalis. But on the bursa ommentalis, you can find this opening called the foramen ommentale, or the foramen epibrochium, which connects the bursa ommentalis to the general cavity. And so around it, you have the vestibulum bursa ommentalis. And if you remember the term vestibulum is the area around an opening of a canal. Alright, and also you can find inside the bursa ommentalis, you can find three different recesses. You have the superior recess right here, and then the inferior recess is here, and then there's one more recess. And if you look at this picture, if you lift up the stomach like this, the spleen is here and the pancreas is here. This recess is a small opening is here, and we call this one the recessus splenicus because it's next to the spleen. So that is the upper level. Next we have the middle level of the peritoneal cavity. Now don't get scared by all these names. We can break these down together. So if we go over to look at this picture, you can see the liver right here, you can see the stomach, you can see the transverse and the ascending descending colon, and you can also see the flow of the serous fluid with these arrows right here. And the recesses listed here on the left are the small openings for the serous fluid, and they're actually located behind the big organ. So let's remove the big organ so we can see these recesses easier. Now, to understand the first two recesses, we need to locate the duodenum of the small intestine. So this is the duodenum of the small intestine, right? So the first two recesses are located at the flexure where the duodenum meets the jejunum. So here's the first small opening, the first recess, the recessus duodenalis superior, while the recessus duodenalis inferior is right under it, right here. And so keep that in mind that these are small openings for the serous fluid to pass freely along the abdominal cavity. Alright, and the two other recesses are the recessus ileocecalis. I don't really know if I'm pronouncing it correct. And I think based on the names, you can already get a picture of where they are. Here is the superior recess. It's where the is above where the ileum meets the cecum. And then down here is the inferior recess under where the ileum meets the cecum. Alright, so next we have the recessus retrocecalis right here under or behind the cecum. And then finally we have the recessus intersigmoidei right behind the sigmoid colon here. So not that complicated, right? Alright, so now the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the lower level of the peritoneal cavity, as shown in orange right here. Now the word exavatio is new. Exavatio means a pouch. So the female has 2 pouches and the male has 1. And since this is a female model, we can already see these 2 pouches. And just so you understand the 2 pouches, let's orientate ourselves first. This is the womb, right? The uterus. And this is the urinary bladder, and this is the rectum. So the exavatio retrouterina is the pouch between the rectum and the uterus, and as the name says, while the exavatio vesicouterina lies between the urinary bladder and the womb, or between the vesica and the uterus, therefore vesicouterina. And then in male we have 1 pouch, and that is the exavatio rectovesicalis. So here is the urinary bladder and this is the rectum, and so the pouch lies here between them. So that was everything I had for the peritoneum, and I hope that was helpful.
I'm sorry. Nagsasalita ako, din ako naririnig. Okay, so it is actually in this first video, okay, wherein a professor mentioned about peritoneal or intraperitoneal. Number 2 is mesoperitoneal, and number 3 is retroperitoneal. Yung mesoperitoneal po, as I mentioned kanina sa lecture, if it is only covered anteriorly and at the side, but not posterior, the entire posterior, hindi. Okay, he mentioned about the mesoperitoneal po. But some anatomists even consider that description of the covering organ to be peritoneal already. Okay, and what are those structures that he mentioned to be a mesoperitoneal? Yung ascending colon sa descending colon. But most anatomists consider the ascending and descending colon as retroperitoneal. Kasi sa kanya, it is also covered at the lateral side. But most anatomists considered, and surgeons po, okay, we found out that the ascending descending colon po sa harap at naka-fix siya sa likod So it is fixed. So some surgeons believe that it is a retroperitoneal, but this particular author think it is a mesoperitoneal. Okay lang yon. Okay? And I will not ask that in the exam. Kasi ibang opinion mga professors. Okay? Now, he also mentioned the retroperitoneal, the mesoperitoneal. He also includes the liver. Why? Because there is also what we call this a bare area at the back. 3 areas but separated. Hindi po isang complete. But he mentioned the liver already as a mesoperitoneal. But most anatomists believe that the liver is a peritoneal organ or an interperitoneal organ. I will not ask that in the exam. Okay, next. The third is what we call the urinary bladder. Okay, but most surgeons, most doctors believe that it's a retro, but for them, for that particular doctor, is a mesoperitoneal. Ayun po yun. Okay, ito po yung, this is the first time that I have heard about mesoperitoneal organs. But okay rin yun. At least na-widen po yung knowledge mo about terminologies about the peritoneum of different organs in the abdomen. Okay? But why? Because it might be asked in the board exam. Okay? At least you have an idea about it. Tandaan nyo para sa kanya naman, it now becomes a peritoneal organ pagka ito, yung blood vessel, it is the one that's attached to the organ. That is only a line where the artery and the vein, artery goes, the vein goes out, and then the lymphatic goes out. Of course, in that area, there will be no peritoneal covering, di ba? Okay. Kaya, a very thin area lang po is being called as peritoneal organ para sa kanya, in that particular doctor. Okay? And that's also true. Kaya if they will ask you, will there be, I think I mentioned that a while ago, will there be a peritoneal organ that is totally covered by a visceral peritoneum? There is none. Kasi kung totally covered po yan, how can the blood vessel goes in and goes out from that particular organ? In that particular area po, there are no peritoneal covering in that area. Is that clear? He mentioned also yung recesses. I think I mentioned that in my lecture. And it was also mentioned by Juan kanina. Okay? But there are more terms being mentioned about in this particular professor. Kaya lang, baka hindi nyo ma-memorize kasi may pagka-Italiano. Is that the Italiano word? Anyway, baka magkaroon pa ng wrong spelling pa tayo dyan. Okay? Sige. So the next video naman po is an American. Kanina para Italiano yung auto. Okay. Then the next po is this one. Ito, Amerikano ito. Balbasarado pa to. Pogi pa daw, sabi nila. Okay. Now, kanina po, the lecture, this one, again, this is a model. We'll be using a model also. Can you see the slide now? Children, can you see the slide? The video?
Yes po.
Yes po, Doc.
Okay.
Hi. When I was a kid, I knew about the organs of the body, but I couldn't work out how they all fit in. I think I assumed they must be neatly organised with a bit of space in between them. Probably the illustrations of the time for children showed that sort of thing. I couldn't really work it out. It wasn't, even through all my school years, it wasn't until I got to university and I started taking bodies apart that I realised, wow, this stuff is really packed in here. We had a comment, was it last week? Somebody asked, could I go through all the abdominal viscera? And I thought, oh. And then I was teaching last week, chatting to a student, she wasn't entirely sure where the stomach was. So I thought, that's a good idea that. We should go through all of the abdominal viscera. So yeah, I've had an interest in anatomy for a very long time, and it hasn't really disappeared. I think the stage I'm at now is the more I know, the more I realise I don't know, and the more I try to hold in my head, the harder it is for me to hold everything in my head. If that makes any sense at all. I think it's the same as anything. As you become an expert, you realise you don't know that very much at all. Anyway, right. So what is the abdomen? And then what we'll do is we're going to take all these parts away from the model. So as we go, we'll point things out. As we remove things, we'll try to see and pay attention to what lies posterior to that organ or nearby, so we've got an idea of where things are relative to one another. Also, remember that whenever we're talking about the body, whenever we use left or right, we're talking about the body's left and the body's right. Okay, not our view, but the body's left, the body's right. And we'll work our way back to the posterior abdominal wall and see what we see. So then the abdomen, The abdomen is the region of the trunk between the thorax and the pelvis, is your typical textbook description, which sounds nice and tidy. Now at the superior end it is nice and tidy. What we're seeing here is the diaphragm. So the diaphragm does cleanly separate the abdomen from the thorax. So the diaphragm's got kind of this curvy shape to it. So it's a three-dimensional thing here. It's curving over the liver here. But the diaphragm is a muscular sheet that separates the thorax from the abdomen. Now, inferiorly, it's a little bit harder because the pelvis, well, here's the pelvis, and the pelvis has these bony parts. So much of the pelvic viscera is down here. This is pelvis, but the abdomen also extends all the way down here. So really, what's happening is that the contents of the abdomen are covered in a layer of peritoneum, like a thin sheet. So it's almost like all of these contents here, like it's all in a bag. And where that bag sinks down into the pelvis, the abdominal contents are sat on top of the pelvic contents, the pelvic viscera, and it's the peritoneum then that's really separating the pelvis, the pelvic viscera from the abdominal viscera. So then that distinction between abdomen and pelvis is a little bit softer down here. And of course, when women get pregnant and the uterus becomes enlarged, or even when your bladder filled with urine and that becomes enlarged, those push from the pelvis up into the abdomen. So there's a bit of interplay between the abdomen and the pelvis. Okay, what can we see? So we see some organs up here. The biggest organ is the liver. It is a very big organ. It's on the right side of the abdomen, but it's extending across the midline to the left side. So it's a very large organ, and it's just underneath the diaphragm. So as the diaphragm moves up and down as well, the liver will move up and down with it. So there's an interplay between the thorax and the abdomen there. So there's the liver, and then nestling into the liver on the left side, this is the stomach. So the stomach, as you can see, is pushed up into the liver. You know, if I take that out of the way, so I don't knock it off. If we lift the liver up, that's how we'd see the stomach nestling into the liver there. Do you see? So they're very tightly stuck together. Diaphragm, diaphragm. And of course, the esophagus passes down through the diaphragm, and if I pop this out, there's the esophagus there, so it dives through the diaphragm. There's a hole in the diaphragm. Now if I put the liver back, this here, so if we take away the skin, we take away the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall, and we take away the peritoneum lining, the parietal peritoneum lining the abdominal cavity, we see this here, and this is the greater omentum. This gets called the policeman of the gut. And what it does is it's a connective tissue sheet that's hanging down from the greater curvature of the stomach, and it's covering all of these organs down here. And it's layers of peritoneum, it's got fat in it, it's got blood vessels. Its job seems to be is that if there is some inflammation in the bowel down here, it will adhere to that inflammation and help prevent it spreading too far. If we take the greater omentum off, now we can see the GI tract. The GI tract, or the gastrointestinal tract, is the bulk of the viscera that we find within the abdominal cavity. It's a long continuous tube from the esophagus and stomach through the small intestine and the large intestine all the way through to the rectum and the anal canal. The rectum is in the pelvis and the anal canal is in the perineum. Now what we see is we can see a little bit of large bowel here. This is the ascending colon. And we see a little bit of large bowel here. This is the transverse colon. And then we see a little bit of large bowel around there, the descending colon. So this is large colon or large bowel. This then is the small intestine or the small bowel. If we remove, you can see how the liver and the stomach are all superior, and this stuff is squashed up against it. If I remove the liver, here's the stomach. Now the stomach is continuous with all of this. We often see in models and textbooks that the transverse colon runs across here, and it looks like a picture frame around the small bowel. In you, if you're sat up, your transverse colon is probably drooping down a little bit like that. So if you're looking at abdominal x-rays, the transverse colon probably isn't going to do this. It's probably going to be looping it down here because it's actually got a mesentery. So the mesentery is a double fold of peritoneum so that's how the blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics get to and from the bowel. And because the transverse colon's got a mesentery, it means it can move around. The ascending colon and the descending colon are fixed in place to the posterior abdominal wall, so they don't move around. The small bowel also has a mesentery, so it is fairly mobile. And of course what's happening is the food is being passed into the stomach and then it gets pushed into the small bowel, and peristalsis and the shortening and lengthening of the small bowel pushes the food along the small intestine and the nutrients get absorbed from it, and then it gets pushed into the large bowel, which largely reabsorbs water and that sort of thing. So it's helpful if it moves around. Right, okay, so stomach. Now, if we take away the stomach, we can see some other viscera deep to that. So this here, this is the pancreas. So the pancreas is doing two things. It's making hormones that it secretes into the blood to steady blood glucose levels, and it's making an exocrine secretion, a pancreatic juice that it's going to secrete into, if I take away the transverse colon, the duodenum here. So the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, and it's forming a C shape. It's curling around the pancreas here. So the pancreas has got this duct and it's going to secrete into the duodenum to help with digestion of the contents that you've just eaten that the stomach is pushing into the duodenum. Right? Pancreas, duodenum. So out here, laterally, that's the spleen. The spleen is at the tail of the pancreas, so it's on the lateral left side of the body. You've got one pancreas, you've got one spleen. So the spleen is a component of the immune system. It's a store of red blood cells, it's a store of platelets, so it can help with clotting and help with replacing red blood cells if you lose them, if you have an injury and you lose some blood and that sort of thing. But it's also a site where you find lots of lymphocytes and macrophages, and it's a site where parts of the immune system are stored and where parts of the immune system can be activated and things like that. So it's got a couple of big roles, not least immunological. In fact, it sends red blood cells, once it's broken them down, to the liver, which is nearby. It's got a blood vessel and it sends it across the liver. Now the liver has got 500 odd different functions. It's got a huge number of jobs. It has a huge amount of blood passing through it. All the blood from the GI tract passes through the liver, and the liver is wrapped around the inferior vena cava, which we'll see more of as we get deeper. So blood from the gut and the spleen passes through the liver to the inferior vena cava, back to the rest of the circulation. Okay, so small bowel. Now, the duodenum is the first part of the small intestine. It passes food into the jejunum, and the jejunum becomes the ileum. So the small intestine isn't the same along its entire length. Food passes, so the jejunum is out on this side, and the ileum is over on this side. And food passes along the length from the duodenum to the jejunum to the ileum. And if you look at the histology and the structure of the small intestine as we go along its length, it changes slightly and it does slightly different roles. So if we take the small intestine out, we can see that the small intestine is, as I said, kind of suspended, strung from the posterior abdominal wall by mesentery, so this can all move around. So now we've taken off the small intestine, we can see that duodenum. This is the curve I was talking about here. First part, second part, third part, then it goes up again, fourth part. And you can see here, this is where the pancreas secretes into the duodenum. In fact, the other thing we've got here is, you might have spotted it, is the green bit there. That there is the gallbladder. So the gallbladder is storing bile, and it's going to pass that bile through some ducts eventually down into this point here. So the common bile duct is going to pass bile into the duodenum here at the same point that the pancreas passes into the duodenum. And the bile is also going to help with digestion. It's going to help emulsify fats and that sort of thing. And remember those 500 different jobs that the liver does? Well, some of the waste it produces is going to get passed into the small bowel to be removed from the body through the common bile duct, through the same route. That's why bile is green, and that's what makes feces brown. In fact, it's recycled red blood cells. Anyway, so duodenum here. Now what else can we see? So we can see the ascending colon and the descending colon a little bit better. We can see the posterior abdominal wall, and we can see some of the blood vessels supplying blood to the large bowel here. Now, on the superior edge of the pancreas, so if I take this off, we just jump ahead, we can see the major blood vessels. This is the aorta, the abdominal aorta. So the aorta is supplying blood to the thorax, to the abdomen, and eventually it's going to send off branches to the pelvis and the lower limbs and what have you. That's the aorta. Now the aorta has got 3 anterior branches, and those anterior branches are going to supply blood to most of the things in the abdomen. So just superior to the pancreas we have the celiac trunk, and you can see it sending off branches to the pancreas, to the spleen, to the duodenum, and off to the liver and that sort of thing. Now on the inferior side of the pancreas we can see the superior mesenteric artery and the superior mesenteric vein. So the superior mesenteric artery is a branch of the aorta. The superior mesenteric vein is going to be sending blood back to the portal vein and the liver. Down here we can see the bladder. So the bladder is in the pelvis, and normally then if we had peritoneum here, the bladder would be covered over by peritoneum, and that would mark the inferior end of the abdominal cavity. That's where the abdomen would end. The descending colon then becomes the sigmoid colon here, as it makes a bit of an S shape and wiggles around, and when it goes back there and straightens out it becomes the rectum. That's what the rectum means. Rectus means straight, so the rectum is the straight part of the large bowel and the last part before the anal canal. Alright, if we take that off then we can see the aorta, and next to it is the inferior vena cava. So this is going to carry blood back from the abdomen. The liver is going to send blood into the inferior vena cava, and then that's going to go through the diaphragm and straight back into the heart, into the right side of the heart, so into the right atrium, and then off around the body. There's the superior vena cava up there. So, inferior vena cava, aorta, we can see a whole bunch of blood vessels branching from it. The really important ones are on here, and of course we can see these two. These are the kidneys. So the kidneys are posterior in the abdomen. They're in the posterior abdominal wall. They are posterior to the peritoneum, that connective tissue layer. So they get called retroperitoneal. So the kidneys are receiving a huge amount of blood. So they've got some big blood vessels. You can see the veins here because the renal veins are anterior. So the left renal vein has to run quite a long way, and it's running anterior to the aorta, but the renal arteries are posterior to those, and they're going to be large as well. So large blood vessels supplying small organs mean that these organs are doing something with the blood, and they're processing the blood. Of course, what they're doing is largely managing the amount of fluid inside the body. You are a bag of salty water. That's what your cells evolved from, and now you have a bag that you carry that salty water around in, and you have to maintain the right amount of salty water and the right amount of salt in it for your cells to be happy and to function normally. So that's largely what the kidneys are doing. They're managing all of that. So then from each kidney we can see these. So these are the ureters, and the ureters then are going to pass urine from the kidney down to the bladder, and they're on the posterior abdominal wall overlying these muscles here. So you see a number of muscles making up the posterior abdominal wall. Now on the superior pole of each kidney we have a suprarenal gland or an adrenal gland. Now the adrenal glands make adrenaline, adrenaline and noradrenaline. Obviously that's involved in the fight or flight response, in the adrenaline rush, in the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, so you can fight or fly, fly away, run away. And they also make a whole bunch of steroid hormones, glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, that sort of thing, which manage, manage homeostasis, manage metabolism and that sort of thing. So again, related to the gut and energy and food and that sort of thing. So suprarenal glands. We've still got the spleen out here. So can you see how the spleen is typically, it's a little bit posterior, but it's lateral. And can you see how it's nestling up into the diaphragm? Whereas the kidneys are a little bit more inferior. And the left kidney, do you see it's a little bit higher than the right kidney? And that's because of the liver. So the liver is so big, it's actually pushing the right kidney, so it's a little bit lower in the abdomen. So if you were to look at a transverse section across here, you might see just one kidney on one side, and the spleen, and all these other bits, but you might miss the other kidney. If you go a bit lower, you'll get a section through both kidneys. You can see them both on CT or MR. You can see the diaphragm then arching back there. These thick muscles here, these are the psoas muscles, the psoas major, and it's got a little psoas minor lying on the top of it. This is iliacus, and these two muscles will join, insert into the femur, and give hip flexion, so they'll lift your knee towards your chest. These muscles here, these are quadratus lumborum, and they're running kind of in that direction from the vertebral column to the pelvis, which will give you a little bit of lateral flexion of your trunk, right? These arteries here, these we were talking about last week, these are the testicular arteries running from the aorta in the abdomen all the way down to the scrotum, because the testes started to form up here and then they descended in the embryo and the fetus, and they trailed their blood vessels behind, and you can see the testicular veins draining back. The left one goes to the left renal vein, and the right one goes directly into the inferior vena cava. So the aorta ends when it divides into left and right common iliac arteries. That's what we're seeing here. The left and right common iliac arteries then divide again into an external iliac artery, which is going to run down to the lower limb, run down to the thigh and the leg, and then an internal iliac artery, which is going to go down into the pelvis and supply blood to the viscera of the pelvis, and also to the external genitalia and that sort of thing. So if I take the stomach off, there's the pancreas, and if I take the pancreas off, there's the kidney. So that's the sort of layering that we're dealing with. Can you see the adrenal glands there? Just popping up. Now the aorta, you can't see it because it's just running through a gap in the diaphragm there, but the inferior vena cava has just been cut because we've removed the liver. And that's it. I can't take anything else off. If I was to take more off, we'd be at the muscles, and I'd take the muscles off and we'd be out the other side. That's what you find inside the abdominal cavity if you take things out bit by bit. Well, I enjoyed that, so thank you for that suggestion. It did remind me of what it was like when I was a kid, trying to work out how all this stuff was packed in and where it all was exactly. Now I do kind of take it for granted, but there you go. Okay, see you guys next week.
I forgot to mention, with regards to the greater omentum, there are 3 ligaments it was mentioned. No? Well, the gastrocolic ligament, okay, the gastrosplenic ligament, and the gastrophrenic ligament. All of these 3 ligaments forms the greater omentum. About the lesser omentum, doon kami nagkakaiba. We have the same, the hepatogastric ligament, hepatoduodenal ligament. But in the most of the books that I have read, and that's the reason why I also include hepatoduodenal. Pero in the first video, he did not mention hepatoduodenal. He mentioned about hepatorenal. So I will not ask that in the exam. Okay? O sige. So the next 2 videos are all dissections of cadaver. Okay? Ito po.
Hello all, this is Dr. Alsop, and in this dissection video we will be discussing some of the most visible aspects of the peritoneum that you need to know for the abdominal wall, peritoneum, and intestine session. So we're going to start with what portions of the peritoneum are immediately viewable after you reflect the anterior abdominal wall, as you can see here. In fact, in order to be able to reflect the anterior abdominal wall, you have to release the attachment of the falciform ligament from the anterior abdominal wall. So that falciform ligament attaches the liver to the anterior abdominal wall. And so when the wall is reflected, it is most easily observable for the parts still attached to the liver. So you can see a little bit of the liver here. You can see it a little bit closer up here. All of this is considered part of the falciform ligament. And it's fairly obvious. It's located between the right and left lobes of the liver. So you'll be, it'll likely be one of the easier things to locate. Now, I think also on the fairly obvious side is a portion of the greater omentum, usually referred to as the omental apron, which is actually a part of the gastrocolic ligament of the greater omentum. And this is the portion of the greater omentum that is 4 layers. It's going to hang from the greater curvature of the stomach. You can see a little bit of the stomach here, but it's covered quite a bit in terms of some of the adipose tissue. And this is the portion that is going to loop back up and attach to the transverse colon. So as you can see here, you can see in both of these images that it's hard to see much of anything else in terms of the viscera because the omental apron is covering it. And it will need to be reflected or removed to see deeper structures. Also note that the thickness and completeness of the omental apron will vary between individuals. All right, so let's get our bearings with this image. The omental apron has been reflected. The one that we saw in that previous image has been reflected superiorly in order to better view portions of the jejunum and the ileum. Additionally, the jejunum and the ileum have been moved a little superiorly as well in order to best view the root of the mesentery. And when I say the mesentery, I mean the mesentery. Oftentimes you just hear the mesentery of the small intestine referred to as the mesentery. And the root right here is what's actually attaching to the posterior abdominal wall. So any of this right here, a little bit you can see right there, all of this is considered part of the mesentery of the small intestine. And it's actually pretty robust. It's something that I think you'll be able to easily observe. And you can see it on this next image as well. Any of this yellow portion is going to be considered part of the mesentery. Now, note that it has to be attached to the small intestine to be considered the mesentery of the small intestine. You can see some other components of the mesentery. You can see the transverse colon here. All of this right here is going to be the transverse colon. It's kind of been reflected up in order to best view the transverse mesocolon, which is going to be the mesentery of the transverse colon. So in order to see this best, you have to kind of reflect up or reflect a little superiorly the transverse colon. Okay, that is all we are covering in this session. There will certainly be specific portions of peritoneum discussed as we talk about specific visceral structures in upcoming sessions, particularly as we discuss the stomach. Thank you for your time and attention here, and as always, please reach out if you have any questions.
Okay, the last video for today's laboratory.
So after reflecting the anterior abdominal wall, I can gain access to the peritoneal cavity. This is the peritoneal cavity. To the wall, here, the wall is lined by peritoneum, which is the parietal peritoneum. This is the parietal peritoneum. Here is the parietal peritoneum. And the visceral peritoneum is applied to the viscera. So the viscera here are covered by peritoneum, which is the visceral peritoneum. Okay. Now let me show you some of the viscera here. This is the liver. You can see the liver. The liver also is mainly in the right hypochondrium, and the epigastrium extends into the left hypochondrium. You can see the stomach. Here is the stomach. See the greater curvature of the stomach and the lesser curvature of the stomach. Also, you can see this mobile part of large intestine. This is the transverse colon and the mesentery of the transverse colon. Here is the mesentery of the transverse colon. And here is the small intestine in the infracolic compartment. See, this is the small intestine. And it's attached to mesentery of the small intestine, which contains the vessels are the superior mesenteric vessels. The small intestine ends into the large intestine and the cecum. This is the region of the cecum. This is the cecum. Ascending colon. And then we have the, here is the hepatic flexure or right colic flexure. Then transverse colon. And then we have the splenic flexure here. This is the splenic flexure. I can see, no, the spleen is not very clear, but I can feel it, but it's not very clear. I will show it to you later on. Then the descending colon and the S-shaped sigmoid colon. This is the sigmoid colon. Again, the sigmoid colon is movable because it has a mesentery. Sigmoid mesocolon. This is mesentery. Again, you can see that it contains fat, blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics, like the other mesenteries. Okay? Now, there is a fold of peritoneum here that is between the anterior abdominal wall and the liver. And this fold, you can see it from this side better now. This is the falciform ligament of the liver. Falciform ligament of the liver. And it's a free lower border, is thick. It's formed a round ligament of the liver and is attached to the back of the umbilicus. Here. This is an embryonic remnant. Embryonic remnant of the left umbilical vein. But still it contains some of the veins that communicates between the umbilicus and the portal vein. And they are the basis for the, in cases of portal hypertension, this will result in caput medosi around the umbilicus. Now, above the liver, I can pass my finger into the left subphrenic space between the liver and the diaphragm. And on this side, I can pass my fingers into the right subphrenic space between the liver and the diaphragm. Between the visceral surface of the liver and the lesser curvature of the stomach, this is the lesser omentum. You can see the fold of peritoneum, which contains, here it contains fat, it contains blood vessels. This is the lesser omentum. And the lesser omentum is not only attached to the stomach, but also partly attached to the esophagus and the first part of the duodenum, as here. It has a free border. This is the free border of the lesser omentum. I can pass my finger behind it. This is the epiploic foramen. And you can see that there is a perforation here in the lesser omentum. And so you can have, you can look at the inside of the lesser sac. So if I pass my finger, it will appear. Now you can see it. Can you see my tip of my finger? Which means that I am entering into the lesser sac through the foramen of Winslow. Okay? In this free border of the lesser omentum, there is a triad of bile duct, hepatic artery, and portal vein. And so it will be located, this triad is located in front of my finger. Behind my finger, the structure is the inferior vena cava. I can feel the inferior vena cava. Below is the first part of the duodenum. Okay, and above is the liver. So these are the boundaries of the foramen of Winslow, or the epiploic foramen. There is another space here, which I will put my hand into. It is between the visceral surface of the right lobe of the liver and the kidney. Here is the place of the kidney. The kidney is retroperitoneum. You can see the shadow of the kidney behind the peritoneum. This is the lower pole of the kidney. And between the upper pole of the kidney and the liver is the hepatorenal pouch. Now, attached to the greater curvature of the stomach, is the greater omentum. See, it's like an apron. Is the greater omentum. It contains fat and it contains vessels. These vessels are epiploic vessels. They are branches of the gastroepiploic vessels that are located along the greater curvature of the stomach. Right gastroepiploic and left gastroepiploic. It sends gastric branches and epiploic branches, and also it contains fat. Very clear here that it contains fat. This part of the greater omentum between the stomach and the transverse colon is called the gastrocolic ligament. So this is the gastrocolic ligament between the greater curvature of the stomach and the transverse colon, gastrocolic ligament. Now if I reflect the transverse colon upwards, now I will not be able to see the gastrocolic ligament, but instead you will see the transverse mesocolon. So from one side I can see the gastrocolic ligament anteriorly. If I reflect, then this is the transverse mesocolon. On the side of the descending colon, this gutter here in the greater sac is called paracolic gutter. This is the left paracolic gutter, and there is a right paracolic gutter on the right side as well. Right paracolic gutter. In fact, the right paracolic gutter communicates upwards with the hepatorenal pouch and with the subphrenic space, right subphrenic space. And it leads downwards, it goes into the pelvis, into the pelvic cavity. Okay?
So Dr. Ghaffar mentioned about the right and the left paracolic gutter. Now the left paracolic gutter, or the left paracolic space, does not continue superiorly to the left subphrenic space because there's a ligament that stops it, that serves as a border, okay, that serves as a wall. And you call that as the phreniocolic ligament. That's the reason why if we do a left hemicolectomy, okay, that's actually pinaka-difficult part of cutting, okay, or releasing the splenic flexure of the colon, because the splenic flexure of the colon is attached to the diaphragm, forming what we call the phreniocolic ligament, which separates now the left paracolic gutter or space to the left subphrenic space. Unlike in the right side, we do not have a ligament that connects the hepatic flexure to the diaphragm. Mas movable po yung hepatic flexure of the colon. That's the reason it was mentioned by Dr. Jafar that the right paracolic gutter, or right paracolic space, okay, is continuous with the right subphrenic and also with the Morrison's pouch or hepatorenal. That's the reason why in cases of appendicitis and it was left untreated and the patient is keep on moving and there is an abscess that was formed in a ruptured appendicitis. Okay, and the location of the tip of the appendix is paracolic in location yung tip. Therefore, nasa side siya ng cecum, nasa right side. Therefore, yung nana will be accumulate in the right paracolic gutter, nasa right paracolic space, that can eventually even go to the Morrison's pouch or hepatorenal and even go inside the lesser sac. And we have a case like that. Okay. Kaya if we have a case with the ruptured appendicitis or maybe the verticulitis po of the colon, ascending colon of this time, ascending colon, and maybe a ruptured gallbladder and there are abscess in the Morrison's pouch, we never forget, okay, to open the lesser sac. How do we open it? We do not open it in the transverse mesocolon. We open it in the greater omentum. Pasok ka sa greater omentum. You can now enter, because if you cut the two anterior layer po of the greater omentum, you enter the lesser sac. And there are cases where we can see abscess also that accumulates in the lesser sac. Kasi if you fail to explore that space, the patient will still have peritonitis. So you have to wash the entire peritoneal cavity, including the lesser sac. And to open it, I usually open in the greater omentum to enter the lesser sac. Only, I think, 1 or 2 cases lang po. Wherein ruptured appendicitis, one ruptured the verticulitis of the ascending colon. Okay, presented with severe peritonitis. The chance of having abscess also in the lesser sac is there. So we also explore that area. Okay, but most of the cases wala. But 3 cases po, 2 for the appendicitis po, and 1 for a ruptured ascended verticulitis nagkaroon ng ganun. Okay. So, I think I mentioned that already in my lecture, di ba? Okay, yung mga spaces. So, in totality po, I think there are 10 spaces that I mentioned in my lecture. So, it's not only purely lesser sac, lesser peritoneal cavity, and greater peritoneal cavity. But it's important for you as anatomists, okay, to know the different spaces. Supramesocolic space, we have 4. Inframesocolic space, we have 6. So, a total of 10. Okay, now I prepared an exercise with you. This is not graded po, ha? Okay, I have with me a list of your names and I'll be calling your name. O wag kayong matakot, ha? It is not graded, but I want you to participate. This time you have to open your video. Come on, open your video na.